Thank you, Alice Gibson, to talk to us today about ethical leadership as a mode of being, a Heideggerian perspective. Alice Gibson is a Bachelor of Arts from Monash University and a Bachelor of Business from Monash University. She has a Master in Applied Ethics and a PhD in Management. Alice, welcome.
Great, thanks, Ellen. Thanks for having me. Right, I'm going to basically present like an overview of my thesis. So I'm going to share my screen. So before I begin, I'd actually like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting today, which is something we do increasingly in Australia, which for me is the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm just going to, you'll see here that I did my PhD at Monash University. So I'm using the slides that I used for the final presentation. I should just like clarify that like currently I'm not working at Monash. So I just want to like make that clear. So in my PhD, I made 4 contributions to the literature. And they're sort of listed here on this slide in the order which I'm going to go through them in more detail in the remainder of the presentation. I've kind of put them up front because, as I said, as a milestone presentation for my PhD, obviously the contributions are important. So I guess to start with, the dominant way that the organizational literature currently sheds light on the ethical leadership phenomenon is through a moral leadership theory lens. And theories like ethical leadership, authentic and servant leadership are particularly prominent examples with a core moral or ethical component. And much of the leadership of this literature associated with like moral or ethical leadership theories seek to define what ethical leadership is. And then, as is common in the positivist sort of perspective, they seek to identify the behaviors and traits or situational independent variables and associated mediators and moderators to define what ethical leadership is. So it's very much a know what approach. So a focus on what the phenomenon is. And there's also an emphasis on delineating one moral theory from the next. And much of the organizational literature on ethical theories therefore sits very firmly in that a priori hypodeductive positivist domain. Now, these perspectives might actually be really useful and really insightful, but the problem that I saw it was ontological, in that they don't actually accord with the lived experience, at least with my own lived experience, and as it turns out, not with other people's. And Martin Heidegger, who is a 20th century German philosopher, was extremely influential in pointing out this ontological problem and explaining it through a mode of being perspective. So Heidegger proposes that we're in the world in 2 important modes of being. In a present at hand mode of being, essentially he argues that we engage in the world and the things in it in a world with objects that have particular properties. And this includes us as human beings. We're just a very special type of object, often called a subject. So this mode of being aligns very well with that scientifically rational view of the world, which is a positivist view, which has an objectivist ontological basis. An objectivist view of the world, of course, assumes that these properties exist objectively, i.e. they exist in the world independently of us, regardless of what we think of them or how we understand them. And much of the ethical leadership literature from those different ethical or moral theories falls into this kind of objects with properties mode of looking at the world. However, before we're in the world in an objects with properties way, Heidegger argues that we're in the world first and foremost in what he calls a ready-to-hand mode of being. And in this mode of being, we're in the world in an entirely taken for granted way, which is why it often goes entirely unnoticed. Heidegger even accuses the likes of Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant of not noticing this way we're in the world first and foremost. And that's probably one of his, noticing this way we're in the world in this ready-to-hand ways is one of his major contributions to philosophy. So Dreyfus, who's a well-known Heideggerian scholar, more intuitively calls his way of being in the world absorbed coping. And I think the child in this picture is probably, in this mode of being of absorbed coping. So to explore ethical leadership through an absorbed coping mode of being is to explore it through a phenomenological perspective. And this is this lived experience perspective. So for Heidegger, the truth about a phenomenon doesn't lie in some representational agreement about what's in my head and what's out there in the world. For Heidegger, truth lies in how we understand a phenomenon. And how we understand a phenomenon in the world is intrinsically linked with how we make meaning from the world. So this phenomenological perspective leads me to my research question, which was, how is ethical leadership understood through the lived experience? So it's very much a know-how approach. So a focus on how we're in the world rather than looking at what ethical leadership is. So this was my first methodological contribution, where a phenomenological perspective is used to understand ethical leadership. Certainly a phenomenological perspective has been used to understand leadership more broadly, but it's the first time, as I'm aware, that it's been used to look at the ethical leadership phenomenon. Heidegger provides a comprehensive, although very complex and very dense, theoretical explanation of how we're in the world in this lived experience way, which is through what I call various ontological structures. So in recognition of the insight that Heidegger's perspective can provide, there is a small body of research in organizational studies that uses various Heideggerian ontological structures to explore organizational phenomena, including, as I said, leadership more specifically. So as you can see in this diagram, what I did in my PhD is used important ontological structures from the literature as interpretive lenses to then shed light on my empirical findings to then answer how is ethical leadership understood through the lived experience. So this is essentially like very simple setup of my theoretical framework, and it's actually called an exegetical approach, which is a fancy way of saying I interpret my findings through the concept of a particular phenomenological philosophy, which is Heidegger in my case. So the ontological structures from the literature, the ones that I use as these interpretive lenses are these ones listed on the side of what I call this the funnel diagram. So they're the ones listed there. So the funnel diagram is supposed to represent the integrated ontological structures of a human being who's standing on the top there. And I'm going to give a really lightning sort of overview of these theoretical structures, which is obviously going to be very schematic, and there's a lot more to them, but nevertheless. So basically Heidegger's ontological theory is a theory of being, and it's grounded in how existence is experienced by the human being, and he calls a human being a Dasein. So a human being is an instance of existence. So contrary to most ontological theories, Heidegger doesn't argue that existence is some special type of property of a human being. Existence is our grounding. So there's nothing Like we experience everything from existence. So one might rightly ask, given that I'm interested in understanding ethical leadership, where's the ethics in Heidegger? Now, it's important to realize that Heidegger doesn't have an ethical theory per se, but what he does propose is essentially a good way to be in the world. And a good way to be in the world emerges from, like my reading, as an authentic, resolute Dasein that acts with positive solicitude and responds to the call of conscience. So there's a lot in that, but basically, like, this picks up key ontological structures that Heidegger talks about. So Heidegger argues that, again, contrary to much of the authentic leadership literature which is out there, that there is no fixed or essential self or pre-given human way to be. There's no one self that I'm true to. He argues that I am how I am socialized. So we are constituted by our social practices. So the fact that we're a product of our social environments is perhaps not very contentious, nor very radical. However, it's important to note that for Heidegger, these social practices cannot be reduced to mental states of individuals. They're not contained in a psychological belief system. That's not what he's saying. They literally constitute how we understand ourselves in the world. We therefore we tend to act as one acts according to particular social practices within a particular world. And when I say world, that might be like a professional world or a country or a community. They're kind of worlds or sets of social practices. And he calls this sort of acting as one acts the they. Now, while this is necessary to live, so like acting according to sort of, or within, you know, as constituted by our social practices is necessary to live together, it's also in some sense a bit of a leveling down, and why Heidegger calls acting in accordance with the they inauthenticity. However, we can and sometimes do appropriate ourselves from our socialized selves and what he calls choose to choose ourselves and be authentic. We always appropriate ourselves from a background of the inauthentic self, and that's why the diagram is sort of situated in this sort of inauthentic cone, if you like. When we are authentic and we heed the call of our own conscience, the call of conscience alerts us to what matters to us. And when we act on this, we necessarily act resolutely. So things and people necessarily show up in the world as mattering to us somehow. And this is Dasein's care structure. And the care structure is represented by the orange bands that are sort of wrapped around the funnel diagram. So the type of care we have for people is what Heidegger calls solicitude. And this can be positive or negative. So if authenticity is a good way to be in the world for our being, it's also a good way to be in the world for others, for other Dasein who are the same kind of being as us. It's therefore a good way to be in the world to facilitate other people's authenticity through positive solicitude. So one might also ask, where is the leadership in Heidegger? So it's important to acknowledge that he doesn't actually have a leadership theory, nor an ethical theory. However, these ontological structures do underpin a mode of being in the world. And as such, they are either an authentic or perhaps even an inauthentic model for others. And what's really interesting is that even under the moral leadership theories, so those authentic leadership, ethical leadership, and servant leadership, they also actually understand leadership as role modeling some sort of exemplar behavior. So in a similar way, this modeling a mode of being can be understood as the leadership aspect of Heidegger. So it's easy to actually understand what these look like in the lived experience, and that comes from my findings. So I'll now, I'll actually just go, before I get to my findings, I'll actually just touch on my methodology. So the methodology that I used was based specifically on Heidegger and is called a hermeneutic phenomenology. And I had 2 stages to my data collection. My data collection had the unit of analysis as the lived experience. So in stage 1 of my research, I undertook 22 semi-structured interviews with senior or executive managers from the energy, government, and built environment sectors. And this focused on a backward-looking lived experience. So drawing on sort of their lifetime of professional experience. In stage 2, I undertook what I called interview diaries as a way to explore the living experience. And for this, I interviewed 3 participants that I chose from stage 1, and I interviewed them for 15 to 30 minutes every day for a week via Zoom. And I developed this in response to the COVID lockdown situation that we experienced in Australia in 2020. So I actually developed, it actually ended up being like a methodological contribution by being a sort of a new research method, which I'll explain sort of in a bit more detail. But before I do, I did just want to touch on my sampling strategy. So from a phenomenological perspective, every person who has experienced ethical leadership has a story to tell. But it's also true that some people are able to draw on a deeper pool of experiences and or are able to provide a richer description. So with this in mind, I actually used a combination of 3 purposeful sampling techniques, and I've listed them on the slide. I also had 3 steps to my data analysis, the last step being that exegetical approach, which I outlined in my theoretical framework. So I won't go through them in lots of detail, but I can answer more questions about that if you're interested. So going back to here, the intensity sampling strategy was supplemented by like a convenient sampling approach that I used to identify who I wanted to talk to. So given the potential for the interview diary to be a research method contribution, I actually then went back and conducted additional interviews with stage 2 participants 2 weeks after we finished the interview diary period. And I did that to seek their reflections on the experience of the methodology specifically. So I wasn't asking them in that case about ethical leadership. I was asking them then about their experience of the methodology. And the interview diary approach, and like what I found was it retains the key benefits of a diary and combines it with the key benefits of an interview. And you can see some of those benefits from my thematic analysis listed on the slide there. And again, I'm actually writing this up in a journal article, so I can go into more detail if this is of interest. But I might just, in the interests of time, jump to my findings. So having done the looking back interviews with the 22 people and then the living interview diaries where I interviewed those 3 people every day for a week, I then took all those interview transcripts and did a thematic analysis, which yielded dozens of themes. I can't remember how many, but there were certainly dozens. But in my PhD, I actually focus on just 7. And I identified these 7 as being either particularly prominent themes, meaning themes that most participants reference often, or theoretically interesting themes given my ontological perspective. And I call the themes key aspects of ethical leadership because it implies, depending on what way you look at a phenomenon, these aspects show up. And I put them sort of on the Venn diagram in this slide because that's supposed to indicate, although I pull out these themes as specific aspects and we'll talk about them as sort of separate aspects, in the lived experience, they actually are all entwined in a messy totality. So my participants didn't talk about them, neatly as separate, experiences or categories. They're actually all entwined. But I think it is useful to pull them out and explain them in more detail. So I'm actually going to read the quotes on the slide, so you don't have to read them in advance or read them while I'm talking. So many participants' anecdotes of ethical leadership and how they experienced ethical leadership revolved around making a hard decision. Now, from their lived experience, many participants understood ethical leadership as having good intentions and took action according to their principles or what they thought was the right thing to do, even when that was difficult or uncomfortable to do. And hence, ethical leadership is in the hard decisions. So the difficulty in making those decisions related to unwanted social ramifications, and examples that emerged in my for my participants included getting fired, having to leave an organization, putting one's life in danger, which was perhaps the most extreme, or being excluded from a community. So the quote I have on this slide is from Ruth, who sacked herself from a ministerial committee. And Ruth says, I was chair in the Ministerial Advisory Council to author a development strategy for a particular area of the city. And we started off great guns. He, the minister, wanted to be bold, courageous. He wanted to be frank and fearless, blah, 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 bullshit. So it went on. And I thought, oh, this is terrific. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Wow. And may I say, we did an extensive community consultation. The chief of staff so later on, fast forward, the chief of staff invites us into his office and he puts this glossy draft on the table. And we go, what's that? Oh, that's the strategy. That's the draft. We're going, I beg your pardon? Oh, no, don't worry. It includes all your stuff. We haven't changed anything. It includes all your stuff. We've just taken it a little step further. Well, heaven's sake, they'd changed quite a number of things, including that they'd taken out all the social housing and affordable housing stuff. They'd mucked around with the climate change stuff. So 5 of the 6 of us on the committee, we'd had enough. We all decided that we'd sign a letter to the minister saying, thank you very much for the opportunity. We've looked at the latest piece of work. We don't agree with a number of the directions in the document, and we cannot put our name to the document. None of the other members would say they sacked themselves, but I openly say it. I sacked myself from the job. So while a prominent theme or aspect of how participants understood ethical leadership in their lived experience was in the hard decisions, nevertheless, many of the participants, and often the same participants, revealed how they also understood ethical leadership in the everyday. Now, references including activities or practices to one's role which are implemented or utilised on a day-to-day basis. And this includes inclusive decision-making, accountable systems, a thoughtful process, or creative problem-solving. Now, these are aspects or practices that are enacted or can be seen in action. Other references showed up in how one conducts oneself, for example, with perseverance, respect, or care. Now, while these aspects of ethical leadership are enacted or conducted can be conceptually teased apart, they actually are more entwined in the lived experience. And what underpins ethics in the everyday as ethical leadership was a sense of right or a specific moral purpose which guided or underpinned their day-to-day actions or conduct. And that was kind of the link with ethical leadership. Now, ethical leadership is leading the way is, I think, best captured in the quote on the slide from Jacqueline. So Jacqueline said, I also think ethical leadership is proactive leadership. It's not just leadership that does something just because it's the trend or because they have to. Again, that's coming back to very much like a compliance thing. Leadership is about leading and being the one in front and being the vanguard and pushing for positive impact. Another key aspect of how ethical leadership was understood by participants in their lived experience is responsibility. So responsibility starts, perhaps unsurprisingly, with self. However, it then extends outwards to accepting responsibility for the things that are in your sphere of influence. So depending on one's role, the extension outwards might include a responsibility for others and may include a responsibility for things like the public, for communities, to employees, to customers, or other stakeholders. Now, a sub-theme of responsibility and taking responsibility for self was integrity. And this aspect is captured in Samantha's quote on the slide when she says, when I think about working across a number of different teams of organization, the only thing that doesn't change in that is me. So my word and my integrity is very important to me. And when participants referred to integrity, they usually meant, as Samantha does, an alignment between what they understood as their values or beliefs and then their actions. So central to how participants understood ethical in their lived experience was acting for the benefit of others, not their own personal or selfish interest or the narrow financial or short-term interests of an organization. Now, this could be a benefit to the team, the organization, but usually it was a benefit to a broader community. So yeah, a community which was important to people in the built environment sector, or the public was a term often used by the public servants. And I think this quote from Roland captures this link with ethical. When he says, to eloquently express the whole thing, I suppose ethical is you're doing the right thing by your fellow man. Ethical leadership in the lived experience is at some level felt by many of the participants. Now, this felt sense, and I've called this somatic references, often showed up as implicit references or throwaway lines in my interviews with participants. It would have been easily missed, except for I had the transcripts and, we're reading them very carefully. However, in some cases, participants were very explicit about the somatic references and that guided and underpinned ethical leadership for them. And these somatic references certainly suggest a more ontological or what Heidegger sometimes calls a primordial knowing. So it's the way one experiences oneself in the world first and foremost, before one categorizes why they feel like that. Now, Edith has a great quote which captures this theme really clearly. And in fact, like I mentioned, she mentioned some of the other themes that we've already talked about. So it's a really good one to sort of identify that entwining nature, like responsibility and benefit for others. So Edith says, so it's important more than ever that we can combine a humanistic feeling, an intuitive sense of integrity with empirical knowledge. So many business leaders have lost touch, and business and society have lost touch of honouring what makes us uniquely human, which is our ability to feel and intuit and have judgment. Part of the responsibility of ethical leadership is, yes, reviewing the data and information, but facts can be so relative and can be so manipulated that I find as I get more senior, I'm stepping back more and more to really go, okay, does it feel right? Does it pass the gut check? Does it cross over and actually doing the right thing for my shareholders, for my customers, for my employees, for the environment, for the community where I live, for the community where the business is operating? Which I think is a really interesting quote, because she sort of thinks it's the facts and information that can be so relative, which is sort of, you know, different to how most people understand it. So this last key aspect I'm going to talk about is how ethical leadership is understood by participants in their lived experiences, is role modeling the behaviors. Now, they talked about behaviors that were acceptable or desirable or good. And this was understood by many participants as the leadership aspect of ethical leadership, which also very much aligns with how those leadership theories understand leadership. However, in contrast to, say, Brown and Trevino, who have the most utilized definition of ethical leadership, they point, so Brown and Trevino points that ethical leaders model the behaviors that their followers believe to be normatively appropriate. But the participants in my study model what they understood, so like within themselves, was acceptable, desirable, or good. What was also interesting is that this role modeling does not depend on them having a formal leadership role within the organization. So it actually doesn't depend, as Brown and Trevino believe, that leaders need to have followers in order to be normatively, you know, and it's the followers' perception of what's normally appropriate. Participants in my study model what they understand is acceptable, and can do so at any level of the, so they might display ethical leadership at any level of the organization. And I think that this comes through in this quote that came out of my interview with Simon, where he talks about a very junior person role modeling ethics in the everyday, possibly ethics in the is a hard decision, by speaking up the meeting, which he thinks would have taken some courage. And so in this interview, Simon said, it was the final meeting where we were discussing just a convoluted version of these undertakings to be accepted. And I can remember it had pretty much gone down to the last couple of minutes. Right, let's decide to accept. And this person, who would have been the most junior person in the room, said, "Can I just ask a question? I don't understand why we're doing this." Now, I would have thought that took a fair bit of courage, saying right to the senior group of the organization who are backing this. And that particular comment turned the entire conversation. The meeting went on for an extra 15 to 20 minutes, and the decision was, no, we're not accepting the undertakings. So the aim in my PhD was to understand these findings through the lens of Heidegger's ontological theory, which is that exegetical approach. So you might recall that the important ontological structures were these ones. However, as ontological structures are the way we're in the world, they're not actually specific to ethical leadership. But the 7 aspects of ethical leadership that I just described in the lived experience can therefore help us understand these structures as they pertain very specifically to ethical leadership. So when mapped together, as they are sort of in this diagram, they shed light and understanding on what I call an ethical leadership mode of being. And you can see from the diagram that it's my interpretation that ethical leadership is responsibility for the self, can be understood as an everyday experience of Heidegger's authenticity. And ethical leadership is acting for the benefit of others, I interpret as an everyday experience of Heidegger's ontological structure of positive solicitude. Ethical leadership is in the hard decisions, in the everyday, and is in leading the way, I interpret as an everyday experience of resolute action. And ethical leadership is guided by somatic references, I interpret as an everyday experience of how Heidegger's ontological structure is a call of conscience. And the ethical leadership mode of being is then modeled to others in organizational social practices. So as an absorbed coping mode of being, an ethical leadership mode of being is integrated in our experience. So it's really important to realize that it's not first a somatic reference that's felt in the gut and then leads to a choosing to choose oneself authentically, which then leads to authentic or resolute action. Although they might have come across as discrete or separate structures, they're actually not separate in our lived experience. They're kind of present all at once. And I think Ruth's example of sacking herself from the ministerial committee is a really good example to sort of explain these structures in a more ready-to-hand absorbed coping way. So in some sense, it's really arguable whether Ruth should have walked away from the committee from a normative point of view. There's a normative moral argument that suggests that maybe it would have been better, like better consequences, if she had stayed in and used her influence to advocate for trying to get back in some of those community benefits back into the strategy. However, as an example of authenticity, my interpretation is that she chose herself resolutely. And in choosing herself, Ruth takes full responsibility for herself and what's important to her according to her own conscience. So she didn't just go along with the crowd. So I've sought to represent Ruth's cognitive thought bubble associated with her authenticity in dark blue, where she says, I can't be associated with this report that misrepresents our advice. So obviously this is an oversimplification for the purposes of the diagram. But the point I want to make is that she did have cognitive content associated with choosing to choose herself, but the cognitive content is not the authenticity itself. For Heidegger, authenticity is ontological, it's not cognitive. So for him, there's no content associated with the choosing to choose yourself. Authenticity is automatically manifested in resolute action. And Heidegger says, and I quote, as resolute, Dasein is already taking action. And I've sought to represent the resolute action in this teal-coloured thought bubble, where Ruth communicates that she's withdrawing from the committee. And the light blue bubble seeks to represent Ruth's concrete concerns for how the changes to the report do not benefit others. So Heidegger refers to positive solicitude as something that helps others to become transparent to themselves. So Ruth did not report to me that she had positive solicitude for other people, or that her goal in helping others was to help them find their own authenticity. No, in this case, it was very concrete. She had positive solicitude for others that was grounded in her concrete situation of identifying, social housing or so helping the broader community, to avoid climate change. So the ontological structure is an orientation towards others, an openness to others that shows up in how she thinks about a concrete situation. And then over here, I've portrayed the ministerial advisor as being inauthentic. And from the story, he appears to be lost in what Heidegger would call the they, and the general situation, saying what a ministerial advisor would say. Oh, don't worry, we've included all your stuff, when quite patently they hadn't. So if all of this sounds like an interpretation, it is. It's my interpretation of my participants' interpretation. But for Heidegger, we're in a constant hermeneutic circle of interpreting and therefore understanding the world. But to conceive interpretation as a limitation is to do so against the standard positive background of seeking for an objective truth that still tries to get out of the hermeneutic circle. It forgets, as Dreyfus says, that Dasein is interpretation all the way down. But this doesn't mean that interpretation has no truth. There is truth. It's just an ontological like truth, not sort of a representational kind of truth. I have missed a slide, but that's okay. I think that basically, in conclusion, what I've hoped to present is an ontological, or specifically Heideggerian, perspective of ethical leadership. So in answer to my research question, the lived experience of ethical leadership is understood as the seven aspects of the lived experience are underpinned by the ontological structures of authentic, resolute action with positive solicitude that responds to the call of conscience. And the mapping of the ontological structures and the seven aspects of ethical leadership together then sheds light and understanding on ethical leadership from an ethical leadership mode of being in the world. And ultimately, I'm hoping that this will help ethical leaders to strive towards ethical leadership in a know-how way rather than a more dominant know-what way. Yeah. And on that basis, I will stop there and see if you've got any questions. What I didn't do is I didn't go into kind of some of the discussion of the theoretically heavy aspects, but I think you get the sense.
Thank you, Alice. Christina, would you like to comment or?
Wow, really? I would like to ask a lot of questions. I loved the presentation and the work. I am still going to reread all your thesis. I am really interested in everything. And before I ask questions, let me introduce myself. I don't know if you already had been introduced to me. I am currently working as a consultant and as a teacher, as an invited professor at Fundação Getúlio Vargas. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Elena's, yeah.
FGV, yes. At FGV, I teach postgraduate students, MBA courses, and I'm also an author, a designer of lots of subjects, lots of courses, all of them within leadership themes. Besides working as an invited professor, an invited teacher at Fundação Getúlio Vargas, I work as a consultant, and I do some mentoring work too, for groups and individuals, most of them in leadership positions, current in leadership positions. I've been working in this field for 12 years now, but before that, I worked for 25 years as a leader myself. A professional life of 25 years, within those 25 years, like 12 or 15 in leadership positions. My academic background is I have a bachelor in English language and literature arts here in Brazil. The course is called arts. A bachelor in law also. I have a post-graduation in project management. So for a long time, I was very acquainted with the positivist world and language. And I have a master in business administration or management, both from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, from FGV. I haven't started my PhD course for the desperation of all my tutors and mentors. But I have to confess, Alice, I was really, really excited and very motivated after I read your work, because since I finished my master, it's been like a kind of a disappointment with research and the academic world. Although I still make research, I still write articles. I have published in the main publication for Fundação Getúlio Vargas, which is Cadernos Debate. I have published an article based on my master's dissertation. I have won prizes with the articles on my master's dissertation. So I had a good path being outlined in the academic world, and I have kind of stopped that for a moment. And now I am really excited to get back to it, because this reading, and this is sort of, I don't know if Ellen will agree with me, because she is a professor, she's in the academic world 100% of the time. But currently we haven't had much research and much findings, or enough findings along those lines here, especially here in Brazil. So I just have to say that I am very pleased and grateful for this presentation and for meeting you. And I do have a question that I noticed. Most of your interviewees are women. I counted there were only 4 or 5 men. And here comes a question that can be really hard. To what extent you think, or don't think, gender can influence the result of the framework and all the reference that you built from your findings?
Yeah, it's a good question. They're mostly women because that's mostly who I had access to. So my job at the moment is, and Ellen will know this already, so I work for something called the Hawthorne Club, which is a network for executive women in the energy sector.
Okay.
So that's, well, yeah, that's why they're mostly women, because that's, who I have like access to. So I was looking in my sampling strategy. I think I mentioned that I was looking for an intensity, sampling. So somebody that's had lots of experience, but was able to kind of communicate that experience in rich descriptions. So from that perspective, I was looking for executives, senior people or executives. And they're kind of, the more senior you get, the less time you have and the less likely you are to say yes to research. So I'm kind of, drew on my networks, which were mainly women. But so my research can't really say anything about like gender, because that's not the lens I was looking at it through. Sure. I think that if I was going to do that, I would have to, it would be either all women or perhaps some sort of comparative study. And in some way, I know my supervisor also noticed the same thing, and she suggested the same thing, like whether to look at it through like a gender lens and actually sort of do some interpretations through a gender lens. And that wasn't my research question, though. Like my research question wasn't gender related. It was, how is ethical leadership understood through the lived experience? So I think that could be a research question, though. Like it could be really interesting to look at, like is there a different lived experience between like males and females of ethical leadership or even leadership? But having said that, the kind of themes that came out in like in the males that I did have were similar themes that came out in my females. Not that there was a stark discrepancy between the themes that emerged from across the participant pool. So yeah.
That could be another research, right?
Yeah. And it could be, and then, that would then have to be like situate, from a hermeneutical phenomenological perspective, which takes very seriously the context or the situation in which, you're immersed. yeah, you'd have to do kind of like an understanding of the worlds of, you know, like gender, like perspective, which yeah, I didn't do for the purposes of this. But yes, could definitely be its own research question. And the other thing that you know, from a hermeneutic perspective, is that things are never static. So like phenomena are not static. So in an objectivist, positivist perspective, something, you know, it is sort of, you know, phenomenon is sort of static and timeless. But from a hermeneutic perspective, it can very much accommodate like an evolving understanding of a phenomenon. And what's interesting is, I think that, and I'm just speculating here, but if you did a research project looking at like gender differences in ethical leadership 50 years ago, my guess is you'd probably get a starker contrast than if you did it now. And that's because, you know, I think that people like women and men and more social, particularly in the sort of professional, like high echelons, are socialized more, you know, the same. So, Ellen, you've got your hand up. You're on mute.
Thank you, Alice, for the brilliant presentation. Finally, I got to know your work. We met at Monash University. You were in the middle of something, and so do you know that now I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of São Paulo, carry on the investigation about artificial intelligence. And I was thinking, while you were presenting, I was thinking cases like Timothy Gibru, you know, the computer scientist working for Google, a Black woman who was fired because she decided to publish a paper criticizing some things, etc. So I was thinking about these ethical dilemmas you were reporting that leaders have every day, which are the commitment with the community sometimes conflicts with the company interests. And that could work in different issues, not just artificial intelligence or the use of technologies or the questions of global warming and environmental. So I'd like you to comment about how they handle your participants, how they handle these dilemmas. I have two more other questions which are more related to theoretical issues, but probably you prefer to answer these first.
Okay. So I think that how my participants resolved a dilemma, like an ethical dilemma like that, would definitely fall into that finding of ethical leadership is in the hard decisions. So for my participants, ethical leadership would be where you saw something was wrong. So in this case, you know, this Google employee sort of at least was critical of certain aspects. And that she took a hard decision to speak up. And that has unwanted social ramifications, which in her case was being fired. So yeah, whistleblower is a really classical, you know, ethical leadership is in the hard decisions. Now that contrasts a bit with that idea that ethical leadership is in the everyday, where you kind of have, like, you're motivated to do the right thing, and then, you know, you do these everyday practices or conduct in order to fulfill that. But in that situation, you might actually be praised for it. It's certainly not, it doesn't go against the social practices. So although you kind of own them. So from an ontological perspective, you're not just doing them because you're going along in this inauthentic sort of the they approach, but you've appropriated them as your own. But it doesn't cause it, so it doesn't cause a tension, as you said. So participants still saw that as ethical leadership, but the tension comes in ethical leadership is in the hard decisions. And that's very much linked in many cases to ethical leadership is in somatic references, where people acted on those hard decisions because they felt it in their gut. Or there was other sort of, as I mentioned, throwaway lines to how people felt about it, like, I couldn't sleep straight at night, or I wanted to be able to look my children in the eye, or I needed to look myself in the mirror. And these sort of seemed like throwaway lines, but because I had the transcripts and I'm reading it very carefully, in the end, some of those were actually the real reason they acted on some of these hard decisions. So I think that from an ontological perspective, there's quite a link between why they actually acted on even though they did get fired, or even though, as I said in one case, like, somebody was ostracized from their community, which is not fun, but they did it anyway because they wanted to be able to live with themselves. So they literally felt somehow bodily uncomfortable. And that was contrasted. I remember I had a quote there from Samantha where she was telling me the story about how she had colleagues that didn't speak up for good reason. They didn't speak up because they didn't want to lose their jobs, because they were in more precarious, they're in the US on green cards. So, if they lost their job, it was, much harder to get another job. So, but they didn't speak up. And then she said that, and I quote, it ate them up. Again, that somatic reference. So they didn't take the hard decision, but it had a cost for them. And that cost was ontological, like it kind of ate them up inside. So, but it's ethical leadership is in the hard decisions. So it's sort of almost that moral courage. And it's a reason they're hard is because it is a tension, a dilemma, which it costs them something.
Thank you, Alice. That link with my second question, I would like to know if somehow you identify in these like everyday practices, if you identify which ethical current would be more influential in these everyday practices, like, for instance, virtue ethics, like valuing personal virtues as courage, as you just said, or let's say in bioethics we say principlism, like if most of the time when they have to take decisions, they are more they are moved more by the principles, like not causing harm and etc. Or it like if they kind of do this rational calculation, like utilitarianism, so this is a curiosity I have, because it's to know more or less in our culture and the management culture, which ethical current from many that we have in contemporary society, which one is more influential, do you think, for this investigation you've made?
Okay, so it's really important to recognize that I didn't analyze it through a normative moral theory lens. So I can't really answer like which sort of moral theory would have more weight, because I wasn't looking through it at that lens, and I didn't ask questions kind of around that to tease that out. And what I would say though is that most of my participants weren't thinking of moral through a normative lens. Like you and I might, because we're kind of, or the three of us might, because we're actually quite, you know, we've got this background of normative moral theories that we would then, you know, we might think about, well, what's the virtuous thing to do here? Or what, you know, what are the best consequences? And we actually have those normative frameworks in mind. But most of the participants weren't, like, they certainly didn't talk about ethical leadership. And my questions were very open. So they weren't particularly, you know, leading. They were actually very open on purpose for the participant to take the concept and explore it how they understood it. And as I said, usually the majority of participants, when they sort of understood ethical, it was that ethical leadership is for the benefit of others, or ethical is for the benefit of others, which for us is a very kind of loose, you know, conception of ethics, but that's probably is how they understood it. And in some ways that probably aligns more with almost like a Kantian approach. You know, you have the good intentions and you act to maximize or to, you know, act as though whatever the categorical imperative is. Yeah, but that's probably as much as I can say, because I didn't analyze it through like a moral theory lens, except for to say that most of them understood you sort of ethical in this very broad, fuzzy way of being for the benefit of the others, for being for the benefit of others. And yeah, if I had to pick one, it was probably more Kantian in nature, not strictly Kantian, but that intention, sort of underpinned by intention. But yeah, Christina?
Yes, I am just accommodating everything here, and I have a question about role modeling. As far as hard decisions have to be influenced by some sort of prerequisite, I have a hard decision because I'm balancing at least two different axiological points of view. I'm balancing choices. The decision is hard because there are at least two different interests in conflict, right? To what extent role modeling influences this hard decision, as role modeling being a prerequisite or a step before that constitutes the person who is making the hard decision. I mean, I think that you mentioned something. I'm sorry, Alice, I didn't have the time really to read everything in full, but I think that you mentioned something on the participants being influenced by their parenting or or about them having some role models that influenced them and made or helped build up some sort of constitution, of ontological constitution that really weighs, that is really heavy, very heavy when they when they face hard decisions. And my question, let me try to be clear and fast, is can we think on the leadership process, the ethical leadership process, as a process of having had a role model? I am potentially more prepared to role model others. I am potentially more prepared to take action that will influence others. I mean, from a perspective of resolute action, to what extent role modeling will influence my positive solicitude that will result in positive, in a resolute action that will really influence others and maybe even disturb the inauthenticity level of the phenomenon and of what surrounds me. Did I make myself clear?
Yeah, I think so. And I guess I've got to be careful because I was looking at, I wasn't looking at role modeling as a phenomenon I was looking at it through sort of this lens of Heidegger. So from a Heideggerian perspective, remembering that for Heidegger, the way we are the way we are in the world ontologically is literally, we're constituted by our social practices. And you might recall that for Heidegger, that doesn't mean some psychological belief system. Literally, the way we move, understand, make meaning out of the world is constituted by social practices. So, and that impacts our mode of our mode of being in the world. So particularly in that ready to hand way of being, that unconscious sort of just taken for granted way we move around the world. And my suggestion was that the leadership aspect was that it was that role modeling, which then becomes part of that broader social practices about the way we do things around here, which is that catchphrase of culture. So, and they can then become part of social practices which are inauthentic or can then be modeled by other people. Let's say that we have this person who is, so for instance, one of my participants was in an organization, and that she decided she was not being treated well, and she thinks that was, getting back to the gender issue, she thinks that was because she was in a very male dominated company and that she was a female and she wasn't being treated well, and she really struggled whether she should go, because that would role modeling and basically leaving the other women, a few junior women in the organization, without a role model and without sort of somebody to go talk to, or whether she was role modeling, you should stay and put up with this shit. And in the end, she chose to go. So even though she and because she actually thought that role modeled that you shouldn't actually stay and put up with this kind of behavior. So yeah, it's very interesting. So and one person, if one person role models, say a whistleblower, is that going to change social practices? Maybe not. But what it may change is how somebody else in an organization then understands, sort of opens up a door for them to grasp their own authenticity.
Yeah, so that's my point. Sorry. That's the point.
It's authenticity. So we're wrapped up in this, so the way, we're constituted by our social practices, we go around the world, we're largely inauthentic. We act as one acts. But then this idea about authenticity, where we choose to choose ourselves, is very much, for Heidegger, a bit dependent on recognizing the way that we do things just happens to be the way we do things. And therefore we can choose to do things differently. We might not do things differently, but there might become a situation where we do choose to do something differently. And if somebody does that, then it opens up the door for modeling that to somebody else. And they might think, for instance, this example of this woman that I was telling you about, she left. That might have opened up a gap for the more junior women in her organization to be thinking, maybe I shouldn't be putting up with this shit either. and then kind of, thinking about that, and thinking about how she fits in with the social practices within her organization. So yeah, it's that sense that how one acts when they act authentically is a model to others, which may be then understood authentically or inauthentically. So it could be that, like you could be in an organization with like lots of great ethical leaders at the top. And so people at the bottom think, oh yeah, that's the way we do things around here, and just act like that, but act like that inauthentically, because that's what we do around here. But it could be that, yeah, it also opens up a gap for them to appropriate themselves authentically. That makes sense.
Thank you, Alice. We are arriving to the end of our conversation today. I'm just going to brief comment for my previous question. I understood that if you would identify any influence, maybe it would be the Kantian, which is from the Enlightenment, the social contract, and things like that. And that also connects with my last question to you, which you might think is boring, but is, I was thinking if your motivation to do this research would be to make a distinction between this Kantian perspective, which is very influential in our modern society in ethics, which separates like practical reason and pure reason, like theory from practice. So if your motivation would be to show a perspective that ethics is what we do in every day, and what we choose to do, what we choose to be, how we make decisions. So it's just for you to comment your motivation and kind of to work with Heidegger and ontology, and if and then I just speculate that it might be to make a distinction from these influential think and Enlightenment and Kantian and modern society. So is this? Thank you.
So no, where I started was actually I've always been interested in it. So even in my honors thesis and then my applied ethics thesis, it's this intersection between sort of normative ethical theories and like, yeah, how we actually what ethics looks like in the everyday practice. And I sort of, through my philosophy degrees, I've come at that through a very normative theory perspective. And as I said, I didn't take a normative theory perspective here. And, I was in the management department. So I did my research in the management department because I was interested in empirical research, and the philosophy department can't cope with empirical research. It's all theoretical. So actually where I kind of started was looking at, my supervisor, Michelle Greenwood, suggested, as I'm sort of talking about, what I was interested in, she's like, you might be interested in a practice theory approach. And I'm like, well, that sounds really good. Practice theory about, that really brings that intersection between, ethical leadership and what that looks like in practice in an organization. And then I started looking at like practice theory, of which there's a number of key sort of, theorists around practice theory. And they all use as their roots, they all borrow very heavily on Heidegger to inform their like ontology or epistemology of like practice and what, practice theory, what their practice theory is. So actually I started with a practice theory approach, and then I thought, oh, well, I would shortcut that and just like go to the root and look at Heidegger instead of having to. It was probably motivated by trying to avoid reading all these different practice theorists and, you know, all the literature that's associated with all the different practice theorists. And I went to, you know, the root of practice theory, even though Heidegger himself isn't a practice theory, the ontological root usually used is Heidegger. And then in my first milestone presentation, one of my reviewers said, yeah, I don't think you really need practice theory. I think what you're really looking at is a Heideggerian, because I had gone to the root. He's like, I think you're really looking at a Heideggerian perspective. And I'm like, yeah, I probably am. So it was almost accidental. Like I actually started with practice theory and looking at ethical leadership in practice. I think that was my first question. My first iteration of the question was, what's ethical leadership in practice? And I was interested in a practice theory, but then looked at, I've always been interested in my philosophical endeavors in ontology. Even though I love sort of, you know, normative ethical theory, I usually come back to the meta-ethics and then the ontology that sit under that. So yeah, really, I think Heidegger has a lot to offer, understanding how we're in the world, you know, first and foremost, that's actually says something that isn't just in the rational. And I think that that's what he has to offer. And I think that there's a lot to understand. For instance, in my case, ethical leaders, which don't go through kind of that rational normative perspective of ethical. I'm not saying that there's no rational thought, you know, and that you couldn't look at ethical leadership through sort of a like an decision-making framework or moral theory framework. I think you can. But I think that this Heideggerian perspective, provides insights that probably wouldn't have been understood or grasped if it hadn't been looked at through that perspective. And one of the things about Heidegger, you know, using a Heideggerian perspective is that he doesn't, the ontology doesn't pretend that there's some static or universal or one thing that ethical leadership is. So it can accommodate very nicely the fact that, well, you know, you can look at this from a lived experience perspective, or you could look at ethical leadership from a normative ethical perspective, or you could look at it from an ethical, decision-making framework perspective, because actually all of those things have, you know, they do show up in the world. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. I leave you, if you two want to give any final comments for us to close the session. And
no, only that I know that, so you're interested in sort of, you have this AI group, and I know that I'm not talking about AI at all, but Heidegger has a lot to say on, is a very useful theorist to think about artificial intelligence. And particularly as, artificial intelligence is how do I say it? Logarithms. Anyway, he's a useful theorist to think about, can an artificial intelligence really experience being, that experience of the experience, in the same way a Dasein, a human being, can? And that could be a fruitful approach.
Yeah, as you mentioned this, I'm familiar with Heidegger. I mentioned Heidegger sometimes in these texts, the question of techniques. Basically, talking about the non-neutrality of technology and how it is a language that it has embedded desires, intentions, and politics. But I think, for example, for business, artificial intelligence comes with lots of challenges. For example, using artificial intelligence for hiring people or for firing people, thinking about, you can use artificial intelligence to replace people in some roles, and then you are going to, so I think a lot of people in management will have hard decisions with these questions of, who to fire, who to keep, and what to do with the people you were firing, and I mean, how to use artificial intelligence, for example, for hiring or firing, to be aware of the possible biases in these evaluations. So there's a lot, there is a lot inside these, and I think it's in the work research. I know some people making research about the micro workers, which is not related to, the companies are the companies who have these Uber and iFood and, these delivery things. So it's like how these companies are proceeding and how they don't have responsibility with the workers and the work conditions and everything. And ultimately, I would say it's, for this ontological perspective, would be also how this is changing our relations, in the everyday lives, how people are, how this implicit is impacting people inside the companies, because they know these changes are coming. Some people might be fired, and so the tensions inside of these, how the leaders will choose, so I think it's a lot already. And what is crazy is because there is a lot of multiple layers that is impacting us or because people who are unemployed or people who are looking for different positions, they are also worried about if they will get a place and all of these. So this is impacting, I think, our society. So I just made this big comment because you mentioned the artificial intelligence and the possible questions that would have to explore with this ontological perspective. So I'd like to thank you very much and ask again if you two have final words. And thank you for your participation today, for your kindly to share your research, which is brilliant. We are very pleased. And and thank you for Christina to participate today as well. And if you two want to make any final words.
Oh no, just thank you. And it's great to talk to somebody who's super interested in my research. So thank you.
Well, I just have to thank you both for this. It was really important to me. And Alice, I'll probably contact you further. Very probably, because it made a huge difference for me to read your work right now in this moment, personally, in my career and in everything I've been reading and studying. And as for the artificial intelligence aspect, Alan, I'd like to make a question here, to leave a question here for us to think on the same lines you were drawing about the worries of employees and more technical professionals about their jobs. I've been asking myself to what extent senior executives and people who hold a lot of responsibility and who have to make hard decisions about other people's jobs and redesign frameworks and design the way artificial intelligence will be applied so that we can at least mitigate the impact of unemployment and all the consequences, to what extent will these people really use artificial intelligence to their own benefit? The hard decision is going to come to this point. You know, senior executive and senior decision makers can also be replaced by artificial intelligence. Will they leave their seats? Will they allow artificial intelligence to do their job instead of doing the more technical and the lower layers job? Because, you know, and when we regard the structure of a company and we regard the structure of leadership itself, as it is shown nowadays in most companies, we're talking about decision-making layers and complex and levels of complexity in terms of decision-making and in terms of process and everything. So it's very easy for me, if I am at the top, to make a decision about getting rid of lots of layers using artificial intelligence, knowing that artificial intelligence can also do my work, can also replace me. It's going to happen, for example, in the law field. You know, what is the point of a law department in a company with artificial intelligence? There's no point. Artificial intelligence can read all decisions in the law world, jurisprudence and everything, and it can write the best reports, and it can write even better reports than lawyers. So we really, top-level executives, let artificial intelligence take their job. Who is going to be responsible for those decisions? I think that this is, we're going to face lots of debates on this, and within big companies, within those really, really big structures, you know, multinational companies, companies who have subsidiaries in different countries. It's going to be fun. Thank you, Alice, again. Thank you, Alan. And
great. Oh, this is like this is like our final comments, open to another debate of 2 hours. So I guess it's to be continued to have another meeting to talk about artificial intelligence in business and ethical leadership, how ethical leadership can handle it, and all those questions. So thank you very much, and we talk again soon.
Okay, thanks,
Ellen. Thank you, Alice.